Oh, excellent. Today is Tuesday, April 29th to 2025, and we're having the session of April of Conversaciones a la intemperie, or Conversations in the Open, which has been a bit delayed this month, but is finally taking place here at the end of the month. And today, the object of our presentation and discussion will be the recent issue dedicated to the thought and philosophical scene of philosopher Reiner Schürmann that appeared on, I believe, the most recent issue of Philosophy Today, volume 68 of fall 2024, edited by professors Ian Moore and Francesco Guercio. There's definitely, and both the editors make this point in their short but incisive introduction. In recent years, we have seen a rise in interest on the thought of Reiner Schürmann. That those of you who might not be familiar with his work, this is a thinker that is inscribing his thought and philosophical work on the horizon of Heideggerian destruction of Western philosophy, as well as the closure of metaphysics in the West. For many of us working on the crisis of politics and the collapse of the modern architectonics of political categories, the thinking of Schürmann has always been of special interest, especially his, or at least through his two major books. The first one on Heidegger, about principles of acting, and anarchy, which is presented as a very idiosyncratic sort of backwards reading of Heidegger's philosophy, and the question that it arises in terms of the crisis of principles for social action, and his late work, Broken Hegemonies, which recasts and rewrites in a sort of way the whole epochal architectonics of Western philosophy to the enactments of principial phantasms and their withering and destitution until the modern time. According to Moore and Francesco in their introduction, they quote Schürmann saying that Schürmann's legacy today, which might be also in the process of renovating or reactualizing itself, is the ability to think and linger on the conditions in which one is inhabiting. So if we are in a certain post-metaphysical scenario, what could that mean today, as well as in a sort of planetary conflagration exposed by a whole array of mounting catastrophes and and collapses of many forms that also the editors take into account. Of course, again, just to mention one last thing about Schürmann, it is interesting that along with this special issue that just came out, that was, I think, long in the making and very much needed, because there's no such a compact and at the same time diverse sort of monograph or place to go to in terms of thinking with Schürmann. Both Francesco and Ian, I think it must be said, have been working on the systematic publication of Schürmann's seminars, lectures, that for a long time have been just an object of academic curiosity, or something that you would have to go and see at the actual New School of Social Research in New York. Now that's becoming available through Diaphanes, and we recommend everyone to try to search and acquire those volumes that keep coming out. Another final point in terms of Schürmann is that something that is appreciated, I believe, in the monograph, in this issue of Philosophy Today, is the inception of what I'm tempted to call theology, or a sort of religious line that is traversing all or many of the contributions. Maybe this is something that we can pick up and comment upon, which has been also at the origin, right, of Schürmann's own sort of philosophical birth through his work on German mysticism, on Eckhart, but that has, at least a decade ago or so, it wasn't as appreciated as it is emphatically exposed in this issue. So having said that, as usual, we have wonderful contributors for today's session. We have with us today Peg Birmingham, who is professor of philosophy at DePaul University, and she herself is the editor of Philosophy Today. Her work is on political thoughts, Hannah Arendt, and continental philosophy. Also joining us is David McCullough, who is a doctoral student at Boston College, working on 20th century European philosophy, interested in Reiner Schürmann and many of the topics that we have been, that we'll be discussing today. And of course, great honor to have with us Ian and Francesco, who, like I said, are not only the editors of this issue, but perhaps more importantly, we have to thank them for this sort of restitution and reactualization of Schürmann's work through the publication of the seminars, the Reiner Schürmann Lecture Notes series at Diaphanes. So I'll leave it at that for now. And as usual, as we have in the series, we'll have the interventions by Peg and David, and then we'll open up the discussion with the editors and a series of problems in the dossier.
Okay, which of us should start?
I think that would be great if it's okay with David.
Yeah, and maybe you first.
Excellent.
Okay, so I'll start. Is that the plan? All right. Thank you so much, Geraldo, for organizing this session. It's really exciting for me to participate. And I want to begin by thanking Francesco and Ian for what is really, as you've already said, an extraordinary issue. And I can't adequately thank them for the amount of work, thoughtfulness, and care that has gone into this special issue on Reiner Schürmann's thought. And as I was reading each contribution, I kept thinking to myself that I don't think any issue of the journal has so remarkably, through the work of Reiner Schürmann, embraced the title of the journal, Philosophy Today. Francesco and Ian's co-introduction concludes with a citation that Geraldo has already mentioned from Broken Hegemonies. To think is to linger on the conditions in which one is living, to linger at the site we inhabit. And I think that really sets, as was already said, the kind of frame for the contributions that follow. And what I was most struck by in these contributions is the weaving together of Reiner's life and his thinking, and including the religious journey, if we could call it that, that really runs throughout his work. And I've never seen that really brought to the fore before. So that was incredibly valuable for me. So I've been thinking about this question of political ontology and the way we could possibly rethink that. And I think that Reiner's work really, and this issue really provides a way to think that fruitfully and further. So Michael Haidt's essay, appropriately placed at the beginning, just after the co-introduction, To Find at Last the Origins, adds another dimension for all of us working in the wake of Reiner's thought, and that is the gathering and preserving of the archive of a thinker's work and life. Without this archival work, and here I want to thank all those who are working on the number of volumes that have been and will be published with Diaphanes Press. So it's really three threads that are woven together in this issue and beyond: the life, the thought, and the archive. Without the last ongoing work, so little of Reiner's life and thought would be preserved and known. And this goes to another topic in his thought that runs throughout the issue, that of memory and forgetting of future and past, and the ways in which they shape the thought of origin, and with this, the ways in which they shape our lingering in the sight of the present, shaping our thinking on the conditions in which one is living. The issue brought to the surface two further topics for me that run throughout the issue: Gelassenheit and anarchy, and the ways in which those two are actually woven together throughout his thought. I hadn't really thematized that to myself as much as I did as I read through the essays. And I'm struck by how these two terms in Reiner's work really rely on each other. To use a phrase of Ian's in another essay of his, and published elsewhere, there are many senses of Gelassenheit in Reiner's work, but this relation between releasement and anarchy seem essential. Gelassenheit as a disposition of the self and all its principled positionalities is at the center of Reiner's thought of anarchy, at least in my view. And I thought that Chris Long's contribution, reading Baldwin and Schürmann together, appropriately placed near the end of the issue, just before Drusilla's interview and Simona Forti's testimony, brought this ethical political task of dispossession, releasement, and anarchy to the fore, as Chris Long reflects on the terrible and ongoing history of racism in the US in our present moment, and which really marks the site of thinking, and how Gelassenheit and anarchy, this disposition of the self in this anarchic way of being, allows us to think of how we might think of the political ethical task of responding to that terrible history. As Drusilla points out in her interview with Ian, while she and Reiner had different ways into the task of thinking, she was an activist, and this was not his way. Nevertheless, Ian's citation from Reiner's reflection on his and many others' embrace of the Khmer Rouge, which gave us Pol Pot, Reiner's words, is striking in how difficult it is to dispossess ourselves from principled, positional, and ultimately terrifying ways of being. And I thought this was a confusing passage, and maybe one of the places we might want to return to discuss, because the citation begins with Reiner pointing out in the context of Pol Pot, and I cite him, "I can think of quite a few situations in many countries in the 20th century where releasement does not bring us very far." He seems there to have a criticism of Gelassenheit, a limitation of Gelassenheit. And then he goes on to conclude in the same citation that releasement from our self-incurred tutelage may not be, and I quote, "as serene an undertaking for us as releasement could be under the sway of interiority and the heritage of Augustine. It may take great variety of forms according to context." End of citation. So what strikes me at the conclusion of this citation, again in this interview with Ian has with Drusilla Cornell, what strikes me is that the citation begins with a claim that releasement can take us only so far, and concludes what seems to be a different claim, that releasement may take a variety of forms, including political struggle, which I think bears thinking further about. And just to remind us, this citation is from the 1988 essay on the philosopher's release from civil service, an interview with Reiner Schürmann in Kairos. Just a few more points that I want to mention perhaps for further thought and discussion. I thought that Francois Dastour's essay, Phenomenology of Ultimates, pointed to further work in Schürmann's thought, which seems to me, I don't quite know how to put this, so let me just say this clearly as I can, that further work needs to be done following Schürmann on the question of the primacy of the ontological trait of mortality and the singularized event in his thought. And there seems, at least this is what I took away from Francois Dastour's essay, but there seemed to be a privileging of the ontological trait of natality and singularity, the singularizing event, over natality with its aesthetic positing of language, the name, worlds, dwelling. And I thought that Dastour's contribution points to another notion of releasement or Gelassenheit, a more primordial natality that we find in his work on Eckhart, a letting be of worldliness, natality as the excess Gelassenheit in its letting be that can never be actualized, let alone universalized, a kind of impotentiality that runs throughout being, that takes further Heidegger's critique of ontotheology. And here I was very provoked by Joel Shriver's contribution on Schürmann and ontotheology. That is a more originary natality, or at least the thought of natality that's inseparable from its aesthetic and universalizing positing. And I thought that Claudia Boracci's contribution on natality undertook this work of thinking further the complexity of the ontological trait of natality in his work. And also, obviously, his tremendous debt to Hannah Arendt, which he always recognizes. And here, this led me then to another thought, kind of following a couple threads, that I thought Marcia Cavalcante's Schubach's and Monica Ferrando's work on really allows perhaps a path of thinking this more original natality that is not aesthetic positing in their respective contributions on the work of Louis Comtois' paintings and Reiner's reflections on them. As Marcia writes, and I quote, light one, never given, light one through layers and layers of chromatic densities, end of quote. So she's asking, and Monica does as well, and I quote again, how to find blended light in the world in which there is too much light at times, has light that has blended and blinded even the light of the night. Where to find a light of beauty, the simple splendor of the anarchic manifold. And I thought this simple splendor of the anarchic manifold, that's a phrase from Marcia's work, contribution, maybe a way into thinking a more originary letting be, a Gelassenheit, that again is not aesthetic positing. And she concludes by noting Reiner's belief in Louis Comtois' paintings in the power of beauty to right all wrongs in the plural. All to say that these two essays for me make a tremendous contribution in asking us to think further the question of beauty in Schürmann's work, perhaps the question of an aesthetics without judgment, or a different kind of judgment that's not positional, but rather sensuous and on the skin or surface of things in his thought. And of course, that was also Louis Comtois' considerations as well, or focus in his paintings. Recognizing many contributions that I regrettably do not have time to discuss, but which have provoked me, and I know the readers of philosophy today as well, let me conclude then with Simona Forti's testimony of being a student of Reiner's at the New School in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which concludes with a reflection on anarchy, again, one of the two central issues for me in this issue on his thought, Gelassenheit again being the other. Simona Forti points to Reiner's faithfulness and fidelity to thought. His ethics of radical honesty, which she submits, points to his fidelity to the polemos at the center of his work, the polemos of ultimates, natality, and mortality, and an anarchic free life, and I quote Forti, that knows that to experience itself, it cannot do without rooting itself in worlds and conferring meanings. But at the same time, it also knows that to absolutize worlds and meanings is to blind itself and in some cases to kill. So I think for me that runs throughout this issue. And perhaps I go too far by saying a privileging of mortality, and perhaps it's more the case that there is this central polemos between natality and mortality that runs through his work and Reiner's work, and also through this issue. So once again, I want to thank Francesco and Ian and all the contributors for this outstanding issue that carries Reiner's thought further. And I just want to say I am so honored as the editor of Philosophy Today that they thought of the journal as a place for carrying on this really tremendous and important work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Peg. So I'll just continue here. This issue, as mentioned, really focuses on the work, emphasis on work of Reiner Schürmann, reflecting somewhat less, but still it's present on the biographical details of the man himself compared to what he would call the discursive regularity that we would call Reiner Schürmann. And it asks the question, what is the relevance of Schürmann for today? As editors Francesco Guercio and Ian Alexander Moore note in their introduction to the issue, Schürmann writes, to think is to linger on the conditions in which one is living, to linger at the site in which we inhabit. Yet Guercio and Moore ask us, is our historical site the same as Schürmann's, who is writing from the mid-1960s until 1993? I would like to suggest that Schürmann's emphasis on releasement, anarchy, and tragedy are even more relevant today than they were 3 decades ago, in light of global surveillance by means of artificial intelligence, the resurgence of nationalism by means of forced displacement and deportations, and the ever-present planetary asphyxiation by means of reducing the Earth to a mere resource to be extracted, all of which were occurring during Schürmann's life, but I think have only intensified since then. Schürmann's concepts such as the double mind, the practical a priori, and the singularization to come refuse reference to any absolute metaphysical first to which we anchor the meaning of being, thinking, and acting in order to withdraw us from doubt, uncertainty, and ultimately our mortality. Such metaphysical firsts reveal themselves only to be hegemonic phantasms. They're hegemonic insofar as they govern the economy of presence of a given historical epoch by means of maximizing some singular as one final referent and excluding all others. But this exclusion is precisely what leads to the downfall of such hegemonic phantasms. They are unable to account for the anarchic nature, the ultimate conditions of experience, which is a double bind of natality coming into being and mortality passing away. These hegemonic archi reveal themselves to be nothing more than phantasmatic human additions made possible only by oblique fidelity to the phenomena, and thus are not only deadly but mortal as well. It is only by releasement into the double bind, unclenching those metaphysical principles that console the soul and consolidate the city, that we come to recognize both the natural metaphysician within ourselves that seeks to subsume all particularity under universals, as well as our mortality, which continuously singularizes such universals. This issue spans all the way from Schürmann's earliest works on Meister Eckhart, most well-known being his book, Wandering Joy, passing through his provocative reading of Heidegger as somehow an anarchist in Le Principe d'Anarchie, which is translated into English as Heidegger on Being and Acting, all the way to his posthumously published magnum opus, Broken Hegemonies. Given the number of really striking and fantastic articles in this issue, and given the time constraints, I will be focusing just on a couple, but as Peg mentioned, all of these articles really are fantastic and illuminating, I think, the continuities and discontinuities throughout his thinking. In his article titled Reiner Schürmann and Ontotheology, Jory Schrevers explores Schürmann's relation to religion and theology. In his earliest works, it's clear that Schürmann wanted a theology that would be adequate to the times in which he was living. Studying to become a Dominican priest at Le Sauchoir, Schürmann emphasized the event-like character of the encounter with God, yet emphasized also that it's not some, happy fusion. He says that it's upsetting to the highest degree, commanding a conversion of the entirety of existence. This prefigures his later work on Eckhart, which contrasts the nothingness of God, designated by the verb urspringen, to the noun principium. So it's an origin, neither as beginning nor end, neither cause nor destination, one that rids us of all attachments, even the attachment to God. Yet conflict with Schürmann's faith soon emerges. And Schrevers suggests that this was his encounter reading Martin Heidegger. Heidegger critiques the history of metaphysics as ontotheology, writing, quote, "Metaphysics always represents beings as such in their totality. It represents the beingness of beings. But metaphysics represents the beingness of beings in a twofold manner. In the first place, the totality of beings as such with an eye to their most universal traits, but at the same time, also, the totality of beings as such in the sense of the highest and therefore divine being." So it's always twofold. It's both onto and theo. Schürmann visited Heidegger in 1966, discussing his concerns about theology, seeking a way to integrate theology into the question of being. He asks whether in the gift of being, es gibt sein, we might move from the S, the mystery, to something beyond it. Additionally, he asks whether Heidegger's philosophy might be interpreted as a preparation for the existence of something else, something beyond human beings. Heidegger affirmed the latter question. However, Heidegger clearly stated in the conversation that the mention of a thou has no place in philosophy, even though the latter might prepare for the experience. To pass from the S, the mystery, to a thou is granted to some in an experience that concerns, again, the all of oneself. Reiner Schürmann would come to accept Heidegger's separation of philosophy from theology, and by 1967 seems to have thought that this critique spells the end of theology. At least that is the claim Schrevers makes. The end of metaphysics likely means the end of all convenience and all flattening for and of thinking. It is the end of the certifying relation, in which thought, in one way or another, settles on a metaphysical first. Over time, Schürmann shifts from a determinate theology or religion to a seemingly vague, perhaps somewhat universal religiosity. And it's likely due to the confluence of Eckhart along Heidegger in his thinking. Heidegger's thinking of ontotheology quickly becomes crucial for Schürmann. The early writings on Eckhart show the impact of Heidegger and his thinking on technology. Technology reduces nature to the state of a corpse, Schürmann writes. It is the exact opposite of releasement, which, quote, breaks the habit of seizing hold of things, unquote. What Schürmann learns from Eckhart is that God may not be a foundation and that in the event of fusion with the Godhead, ultimately the mind has God where he has no name. There is neither theology nor an eternal thou here, only the desert of spiritual life. The Godhead, for Schürmann, does not pose itself under beings as their foundation. It supports nothing. It simply releases the human being and God and presents them to one another without why. My question, which leads us into the next article, but I think still stands even afterwards, is that my question is whether this without why, this life without WHY, without reference, is it without reference to any purpose, any telos whatsoever, or without reference to just one universal telos under the pros-hen equivocity of Aristotle, relation to one? Put another way, does it open the way for a pluralizing polymorphous why by faithfulness to the anarchic event of presencing, or does it strip us of any reference to why whatsoever? In his article, From Principial Theoria to Anarchic Praxis in the Radical Phenomenology of Reiner Schürmann, John Krummel clarifies Schürmann's notion of ontological anarchy and anarchic praxis, looking specifically at its political implications in relation to political anarchism. Krummel describes ontological anarchy as the recognition that being is ultimately without why or without any lasting principle or arche. Principles come and go just as living things are born and die. Thus, there's a transition from metaphysical theoria, invoking a relation to one normative principle to which action refers, to a perhaps post-metaphysical praxis, which corresponds to the presencing of polymorphic singularities. Could we live or act without assuming a ground or foundation? Schürmann, in Broken Hegemonies, repeats Samuel Beckett's utterance, no ground but say ground. We cannot help but say it, even when there is no ground. We're caught between the fact that there is no ground and the inevitable urge to ground. Schürmann is skeptical of the ability of language to ever fully articulate or encapsulate or subsume the ultimate conditions of experience. It's always a differend between concrete singular this in experience and the way we nominalize in everyday speech. This accounts for our tendency to universalize. It's the natural metaphysician within us. As we forget the gap between the phantasm and the experience, its verbal origin and singularity become occluded. Once a universal is set up, other phenomena can be referred to it through subsumption and through what he will call the megalomania of desire. Eventually, this can become maximized into one final referent. Schürmann traces the institution and destitution of the various archai, the metaphysical principles that begin and command historical epochs as hegemonic phantasms by means of a topology. Schürmann identifies three epochs founded on the principles of the one for the ancient Greeks, initiated by Parmenides and ending with Plotinus, nature for the medieval Latins, from Augustine and Cicero all the way to Eckhart, and finally, self-consciousness or subjectivity for the moderns, speaking the vernacular, beginning with Luther and Kant and ending with Heidegger. Yet, as topology shows, these principles are always precarious. Schürmann's topology reveals the ultimate conditions of experience to be natality and mortality. This inclination to posit and maximize the common as natality and opposes it to mortality, the paradigmatic fact that everything inevitably and eventually comes to an end. Yet natality and mortality are a double bind, not a dialectic in which there is sublation or reconciliation. It's an originary but non-binary tension between the centripetal and the centrifugal, or the late legislative and transgressive forces. In Schürmann's earlier work, Heidegger on Being and Acting, Schürmann seems to ground, for lack of a better term, anarchy in the hypothesis of metaphysical closure by technology. He refers to Heidegger's insight that this age is dominated by positionality or Gestell, in which everything, including humanity, is reduced to objectness, subjected and objectified as mere resources in a standing reserve. Technology as such is the last form of any epochal principle. Here, the entire metaphysical tradition appears to be coming to an end. Yet, in broken hegemonies, there's both continuity and discontinuity in the history of ontology, owing to the irreconcilable double bind, rather than one unified metaphysical epoch that appears to be in its last breath. It's always already fractured from within, from an originary dissension. It is instead only the destitution of the most recent of historical epochs, modernity, that appears to give way to what Schürmann calls peremption, signifying a divestment from hegemonic order as such and a recovery from the tragic denial of its double bind. This peremption deprives us of any possible ultimate recourse to phantasms, the loss of every hegemony and hegemonic thinking as such. The question then that Krumel poses, and I would still like to pose even after reading this, is does ontological anarchy entail political anarchism? Because at first glance, this appears to be deriving political action, again, from metaphysics, even albeit, an ontological metaphysics, right, or anarchy. For Schürmann, the impossibility to institute a totalizing nomos frees the public sphere from univocally binding phantasms. Catherine Malibu argues that ontological anarchy as such would seem to imply political anarchy, but also questions Schürmann's apparent self-distancing from political anarchism when he differentiates its concepts from the political philosophies of Proudhon and Bakunin. He sees these thinkers as remaining metaphysical, all too metaphysical, by deriving their political praxis from metaphysical theoria. Schürmann, however, collapses the distinction between theory and practice, owing to the loss of many metaphysical first. Krumel writes, this would entail action without why, described as faithfulness to the constitutive openness of the political event and its radically contingent possibilities, rather than imposing an order founded upon one's archic vision. Schürmann appropriates Foucault's notion in terms of an anarchistic subject who constitutes itself in micro-interventions aimed at resurgent patterns of subjection and objectification. Additionally, Schürmann shared Hannah Arendt's fascination with those rare moments of freedom in history, moments of interregnum where one order of rules is about to vanish and a new one has not yet entirely come into place. Literally times of anarchy and the absence of governance, junctures of history in which people act in concert to perhaps found new institutions of liberty. Here it's fascinating because it seems like, well, there's, that it's in between destitution and institution, but perhaps this gives way only to another, archic kind of politics. That's my concern here. Schürmann proposes an alternative type of political thinking that refused to restrict itself to the pragmatics of public administration, as well as to the romantic escapes from it. But if we are to reserve the term political philosophy for theories of collective functioning and organization under one norm or principle, then Schürmann suggests abandoning this title of political philosophy. Krumel connects this political thinking to Schürmann's engagement with Eckhart and Soto Zen. He writes, Schürmann summarizes the Zen path to lead from the active ego to the self who lets being be. For both Zen and Eckhart, letting go or letting be is the encompassing ethos required for life in tune with the right measure. When we let go of representations of a supreme standard, the measure gives itself naturally of itself. an event in the middle voice. Thus, the three themes that are continuously articulated throughout Schürmann's work, releasement, anarchy, and tragedy, appear to almost converge in the end. Releasing ourselves in the tragic bind reveals the ultimate conditions of experience, itself anarchic, opening way to a practical a priori, acting in accordance with the fluctuations of phenomena.
Thank you so much, David, and also Peg. Well, I think we have quite a lot on the table. Very, very brilliant and thought-provoking presentations on many different elements. So Francesco and Ian, feel free to respond and pick up whenever on whatever element you wish. However, I also wanted to ask you both if you can just say something briefly about the genesis of the issue, and perhaps since this has come up in all of our comments, if you can say a little bit more about what were you suggesting with a sort of displacing and coming to terms with that distance between Schürmann's epoch, when he was thinking in his own historical conditions, and our own conditions, reading and thinking with Schürmann, right? In relation to metaphysics or the question of politics that has also emerged.
Yeah, I could say a few words on the origin of the issue first, and maybe Francesco, you could take up the latter question. So this issue was 4 years in the making. I recall talking with Peg about this in early 2021, and I was thinking about Schürmann's importance as an original thinker and not so much as a commentator. So I had known Schürmann's work primarily through his reading of people like Meister Eckhart and Heidegger. I thought he provided the most provocative, the most thought-provoking readings of Eckhart's and Heidegger. But then I was talking with Peg in early 2021 and trying to think about Schürmann's work on its own terms. What does he have to offer to philosophy today? Beyond being an original and an exciting reader of figures throughout the history of philosophy. So we planned the issue. Francesco came on board. Francesco and I have been working closely together, both writing on Schürmann and editing Schürmann's work. And so we invited a lot of people we thought could provide, exciting commentaries and really try to think about Schürmann's importance for philosophy and trying to bring back his ideas. I think Schürmann, having died rather young, in his early 50s, right, prevented a lot of his work from becoming as well received as I think it otherwise would, right? Broken Hegemonies is a really important book, but it's editorially, it needed some editorial work, I think, and some sort of configurations. In fact, that's what Badiou told Schürmann toward the end of Schürmann's life, that you need to basically rewrite this. And then Schürmann dies tragically of AIDS in his early 50s. So that's the beginning of the project, and it took many years, inviting people, translating texts, interviewing, and here's the result. Thank you all for your dedication to the issue and for your comments and interventions. Francesco, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I wanna thank you, Ian, for inviting me as a friend and colleague. It was an extremely generous invitation, and just the amount of essays that were produced and our conversation today are actually like evidence, right, of the importance of the the work that is being done on Reiner Schürmann. I want to thank Peg for being the editor and for allowing us and for thinking together with Ian about the issue. David for being here today, and I also want to remind everybody that David has a beautiful essay on the manifold senses of anarchy. In Reiner Schürmann, as Ian has on releasement, right? So that could be actually other, this could be a line of thought if you guys think about it, like of other concepts in Schürmann, for example, tragedy or I was thinking lately on love, for example, in Schürmann, right? Just jamming on Christopher Long's essay, for example. And I want to thank Gerardo for allowing us to be here today, for thinking about and discussing the issue. Just before I reply to a few comments and questions that were raised, I want to say that Gerardo and I met actually at the New School Archive while we were both perusing through Reiner Schürmann's lecture notes. So we're all kind, and you can see how even personally, right? And there's a lot of links among us. And this is I think that the question whether Schürmann's site is our site is actually a very important question, which we actually in a sort of epoche, he and I attempted and maybe even succeeded not to answer as editors, right? And we tried to leave it to the contributors. I just want to say a couple of things about it. First, that biographically, as Jan reminded, Schürmann died very young, right? Biographically, our site could still be his site, right? If you think about it. But I think that maybe this kind of question can be raised not only in terms of absolute chronological difference, that it's an epochal, and also kind of destinal difference, but it can also be raised through Schürmann's thinking of the difference or the different between systematic and historical, right? I think that what actually thinking through the site that we inhabit or we live in, regardless of whether it is a sort of chronological shared time in a sort of historical continuum. It both requires an extreme contingency and also a very much transcendental kind of look. If you think about it, Schürmann, when he says he uses a very Kantian lexicon and terminology, and in that same context, when he says thinking is lingering on the condition one is living, he also says I really want to explore, and he's he uses Anna Arendt's title, right? I want to his work has been, and he sees it, right, even not only in Origins, which is a récit or a quasi or semi or pseudo biographical account. He says my work has been into, through, or on the human condition. Right, so a human condition, there's nothing more, what, maybe we could ask what maybe what is this kind of rift, if it is a rift between, because it has to do with our sharing, our commonality, it's of a time also that we share, right, of a site that we share, and how we share it has humans, right? And what is the condition for that sharing of the same site? which, you know, it might be, you know, and this has a lot to do with preemption, for example, right? So, you know, I think that maybe we can keep discussing on this, but my, you know, my question on the question, my counter question would be, right, like how do we think through Schürmann and along with Schürmann, how do we think the condition that makes us live the same site, both historical and systematic, I'd say. And Ian, I don't know if you want to say, but you know, maybe you know, Peg and David, so they were really great interventions. So there's a lot of at stake, right? But I don't know if you want to add something, and then maybe we can, I don't know, discuss about it.
Yeah, good. I like that formulation there. What is it that we continue to do that brings us back to or sort of reinforces the very site that Schürmann was living? And I think David brought this out nicely as well. And that's my own position, that it seems to me we live in a more sort of acute, almost more egregious variation on this site with the resurgence of totalizing tendencies, principles, the climate crisis. So that's how I would be inclined to answer that question. I don't know if we should turn now to some of their questions specifically. Gerardo, does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, so I thought maybe I could tie a couple of them together. First, regarding David's question about the life without why, is Schürmann asking whether we can live simply without any kind of normativity, any kind of purpose, why, however provisional that might be. There are moments in his corpus that seem to point in that direction. I think earlier with Eckhart, and even in the Heidegger book, there seems to be this possibility of living for the singular alone, living only for dispersion. And he sees this, for example, in William of Ockham, right? A kind of nominalism here where we only have singulars. And the task is to sort of destitute any kind of universalization, commonality, even if that is at a kind of regional level. When he moves into Broken Hegemonies, Schürmann becomes very emphatic that we cannot live for the singular alone. In as much as we speak, we must use universals that occlude something about the singular. So it's inevitable. He says there's a kind of natural metaphysician in us. You might say a natural ontotheologian in us. And what he sees the task of Broken Hegemonies as accomplishing, among other things, is not simply rehabilitating the singular that had been occluded by the fantasized common, but also trying to think about how we can sustain both the singular and the universal, but without letting the universal become hegemonic or maximizing. So how is it that we can have, let's say, provisional norms, revocable norms, trying to keep our eye at the same time on the singular, and preventing the complete obliteration of the claims of the singular. So how do we really inhabit a site that is constitutively tragic? And it strikes me that Schürmann thinks we can avoid the worst of tragedies, which he takes to be totalitarian, precisely by sustaining the tragic, the tragic condition of both the human being and of being itself. So this then leads me to think about, well, what is natality? To turn to one of Peg's questions. Is it simply a bad thing, right, that needs to be counteracted by the privileging of singularity? Schürmann largely seems to suggest yes, but there are, I think, moments in his corpus that do invite a question of let's say a less violent version of natality. And he gives a few examples in an essay called "Only Proteus Can Save Us Now." I think this might be in the second portion of that, which was his response to you, Peg, at SPEP back in, I think, 1992. I think the three examples he gives there for natality are falling in love, right? Not necessarily a bad thing. Sitting down to write a book, again, not necessarily a bad thing. And then founding the United Nations. I'm not sure exactly how he's thinking about that there, but that does seem to suggest the possibility of, let's say, inhabiting a world, of having birthing something new that in some sense is stable, or at least holds for a while, but one that would also bear in mind the claims of the singular, the singularizing undertow. So I think that's a big project for us in thinking with Schürmann is how do we think natality in let's say a more sort of robust sense, a fecund sense, rather than just simply as something that we need to be on guard against.
If I can add something to this, I think it's very much on point. This I mean, at least for the like the perception of what of the site that we are inhabiting, it's I mean it's quite clear how the site that Schürmann was living in, it just harshened, right? It just hushed. It became even more so the denial of the tragic condition became even more as he in a way he foresaw, right, that it would become even more violent and more cruel in a way. We can see how this like in the last like probably like 30 years, right, since 30 and plus years since he died, how this like even the resurgence of what he would call like the like the hollow idols, or the hollow language of like the last man, Nietzsche's the last man, right? I mean is I think that it, in the site, if we want to call this site that we live in as he did, like the site of peremption, right? The condition of peremption is that it marks a condition of impossibility, and the condition of impossibility is it's basically it's the impossibility of blinding oneself, let's say unconsciously, or like but it's very much possible to still blind oneself consciously, right, or willingly. And we see how I think we can see how very much this willingness of blinding oneself before or against the simply the tragic condition of being and of human being, as brought up a site which is very much more machinic, right, and very much more the net is and the is clenching even more solidly and cruelly, because it is very much a sort of this is a sort of interregnum, right? I don't know if I can remember if like that's the concept was brought up too. But on this particular issue of the without why, and also David's question on like the political anarchy, ontological anarchy, Without why, I think that, like an I mean, Schürmann was the head of the department. He lived as a professor. Like he was not living as the boscoy. Like grazing and pasturing around like on four, like like in the desert, like in Syria, for example, as like 2,000 years ago, right? He was function. So uh, and Eckhart as well. He sometimes like we bring up the Eckhart's example, right? Eckhart was not just a preacher, but he was like he was one. He was a professor in Paris at Sorbonne. He was a very much high. He was in a very much high position, right, in the Dominican order at that time. So I think that Schürmann actually maintained and kept, even in his, if you want to call it detheologization, or I would call a mystic detheologization of Eckhart's thought. He maintained that it's a question of modality, right? And you can see even Heidegger's influence in this, right? I mean, living without why authentically, I don't want to go into a jargon of authenticity, but it's just an existential modification of inauthenticity, right? So you could live, you could have any sort of teloi, right, of ends, as for example, falling in love or starting a book, or but I think it's the dispossession for the archaeoteleocratic structure of action that like that we should probably bear in mind when we are thinking about how live without a why. And I mean, this I find it close to Paul's Osme, for example, right, on not living not as, or even Agamben's take on this. It might be it's problematic because he has it is rooted in the Christian tradition, right? But like there might be I mean, this is a question also for like a sort of destitution, right, of action. And only to finish on the political anarchy question, I think your question was on like and if one live as an ontological, if one live ontologically anarchically, let's say, so that we don't use like nouns, but we just use adverbs, which is a very Cartier move. Must one also be a political anarchist? I would say that I would turn the question around once again, and it's not just a rhetorical move. I really think that this is the way I've been trying to think through Schürmann. I think that to be a political anarchist, the condition for being a political anarchist is to live ontologically anarchically.
Well, everything that has come out, that has been said, is truly thought-provoking, very interesting. While listening to some of the interventions, I was also thinking about the problem of language, which seems to be one of those one of those instances, or perhaps one of the primordial sites of a koine, right? Of a certain commonality of that human condition that you alluded to, Francesco, right? Um, and I would put this also in relation to the advanced stage of the Gestell that David brought up, right? To that crushing weight that has intensified. Perhaps we are, and I believe that we are indeed in the same site, right? Um, but in a more grotesque, right, and absolutist way. Of course, I think that uh, in a certain Heidegger, that advanced stage of machination was also the problem of cybernetics, right? And cybernetic is an advanced stage insofar as it also puts pressure, right? It initiates a totalizing destruction of language, right? And so, I mean, this is a interesting problem because it seems to me, and of course, Francesco and Ian correct me, really, if there is actually some material about this, but it seems to me that one of the lacunas or sort of like non-set spaces in Schürmann's work is a sort of confrontation with language, right? And poetics in a way. Of course, there is the essay on René Char, I think something on Hölderlin, but those, from what I remember reading them a while ago, those were like very minor pieces, right? I remember that at the beginning or some point at the beginning of Broken Hegemonies, Schürmann, in fact, goes to say that his intervention wants to remain at the ticket of the philosophical tradition, that is within the sort of like the canon, right? So he was not very, and I think in an implicit allusion to Derrida, he said, I'm not too interested in the margins of philosophy, right? He wanted to say at the ticket of the tradition. So I wonder if a sort of slight displacement has to do with, and I feel that there's a certain movement like this in some of the contributions, especially those, for instance, about painting, right? That is Schürmann as a reader of painting and the image as the essay by Monica and the other one by, sorry, I can't remember how to say properly her last name. Yeah, Marcena. Those are, in a ways, expositions in which there is also a sort of double bind between the image and as a sort of sensitivity of language, right? If we understand language also as a site of a sort of ethical renewal, right? So I wonder if there's anything to be said about the relationship between Schürmann and language in this sort of displacement that we're trying to think, right, between Schürmann in his moment of writing and now, right? I guess one last thing it would be that another way that I'm thinking the problem of language and ethics, right? Even in the strong Wittgenstein sense, right? That ethics is a problem of language that one cannot speak about, right? Is that in the writings of Schürmann, even at the end of Broken Hegemonies, there's I think a footnote where he's envisioning, right? Where he says something about, well, there are rare moments of freedom, right? Where something like direct democracy or communal form can deter a total subsumption of representation, right? Of principial politics of experience, right? I wonder if precisely Schürmann's own sort of intervention was still in an epoch of thinking about modifications of politics, right? Even if it is anarchic politics. Whereas today, or at least for me, politics seems to ruin, right? Or the devastation in itself is it has extended to such a degree that rare moments of freedom cannot really be thought in as a reworking of politics itself, right? It has to go beyond. It has to confront issues like the question of language.
I could say a few things on the question of language, and Francesco or others, maybe you can pick up on this. It is striking how negatively sort of charged Broken Hegemonies is with respect to language. So language represents this great danger. It's of a piece with natality for him. And it's puzzling, right? Because poetic language, for example, natality as Hannah Arendt understands it, are precisely ways in which I think to resist the kind of totalization that Schürmann is so concerned with here. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I mean, in a way, I'd like to bring some of his earlier reflections to bear on Broken Hegemonies. For example, Claudia Baracchi quotes as an epigraph, a passage from the English version of Schürmann's Heidegger book. I'll just quote a little bit of it here at the beginning of her essay. Thinking and poetry corrode teleocracy as rust from a gentle rain corrodes iron. Again, it is Meister Eckhart who dared translate such corrosion into a discourse on action. The just man seeks nothing in his works. Those are serfs and hirelings who seek anything in their works and who act for the sake of some way. Why? And I was struck by that passage because of the introduction of poetry there, right? So somehow poetic language has this possibility of breaking, destituting teleocracy. But that's not something that we get. He doesn't really sort of develop that in Broken Hegemonies. So I think it's a problem, a lacuna, as you said, in Schürmann. But I think there might also be resources in the earlier Schürmann to help us think through this without necessarily leaving him behind in order to do so. I mean, he wrote a story, right? A récit, a novel, after all. I mean, that Schürmann who writes that novel is very different from this sort of austere picture of Broken Hegemonies that wants to remain sort of within the kind of systematic tradition, says we have to kind of lay out the conditions for the possibility of human being and also lay out the conditions for being. So how do we sort of bring that Schürmann, that more systematic Schürmann of Broken Hegemonies, together, let's say, with the Schürmann of Les Origines, of his quasi-autobiographical novel, and the Schürmann who sees in René Char and sees here in this quotation a rich possibility of poetic language that significantly differs from the universalizing character of language that he's criticizing in Broken Hegemonies.
Thank you, Ian. And if I can maybe add something on this, I think it's. Peg, do you want to go ahead? Please go ahead. Go ahead. No, I'd like to hear your comment as well. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, again, I also want to hear yours. I think that's what struck me. Just following from Ian's point about, and I haven't had a chance yet to really study the new volume that's, I think, just come out with Kieran and Nicholas on the place of the symbolic. But I think my sense is, and then we have an essay that I haven't been able to also study by Kieran on the symbolic. But I think that might be a place where Schürmann is offering something other than language as a system of representations in which were again configurations that are positional and all that comes with that. So it was what I said. I was really struck by the two essays by Monica and Marcia on this, Reiner's reflections on Louis Comtois' paintings as a way that we might work our way into thinking with him of a different, and as you say, Ian, on poetry as a way through, or at least another thinking about language that's non-thetic and positional, or at least it has something more than. So that's, I'm just all to say, Ian, I'm agreeing with you, and I'm also, I don't know how this would work its way in. I think this goes to David's question, really provocative on, how did you say it here, David? I wrote it down. Does ontological anarchy drive political anarchy? So this relationship between ontology and politics. And I wonder there too, I just was thinking about Claude Lefort, his claim that the political is always sustained by two registers, the mise en scène and the mise en scène, the staging of the political and the sense of the political. And again, this is just an intuition. Whether the place of the symbolic in Reiner's work is going to offer us resources in thinking that dual register of the mise en scène and the mise en scène. So I'll leave it at that because I really don't know. For me, this would be part of the ongoing work now coming from our conversation.
I think it was a fantastic comment. He was, like since the beginning, and even, if you just think about how, like his three-tiered temporal understanding of Heidegger's thought, right? The economy, like either principial or anarchic, anyway, is a mise en scène and a mise en scène, no? So it's very much, and I think that the worldling of a world, or like the coming into constellation of phenomena like is at the center of Schurmann's thought throughout this is life, right? I mean, like since the 60s, and like and the writings in Ways of Releasement, like the early writings from the 60s also show this, and like the writings on the symbolic, that they're now collected in the place of the symbolic, like they also show how how he was struggling all through his life to grapple with and to grasp like ways of mise en sens and mise en scène, right? So and just sorry, just it was like a commentary on your comment too. To reply to Gerardo's very important question. Also, I also language language is another very big topic for Schurmann, right? And has always been through his life since the 60s. And he has to do a lot, like for like I mean, think about his reflection on the Tao, for example, how to address, like even one, like the a short piece, like it's the word of God, a short piece that he and I edited, like from his papers, right? And it's one of his, actually, it's handwritten, from the early 60s. So like the word, of course, consider also where he was coming from, right? And the word, but also so I'll try to go in order because there's a lot at stake here. So the reflection on language and the limits of language comes out in not only in the 60s, early 70s, but in the essays on the symbolic, but it comes out in the Heidegger book and the Broken Hegemonies as well. And I think that all of those steps are actually like they're questions that he raised to himself, and he tried to in a way respond to himself. For example, if you Kiran was very right on point, right, in his essay on the symbolic, and see how in a way that that path didn't follow or didn't continue through the the 80s and the early 90s, because he like Schurmann saw how like how mythical was that kind of thinking in a way. And the Heidegger book, in a way, it is a sort of completion of that time, and even a sort of the step beyond, like the chapter on the symbolic that was in the dissertation was not included in the book that that everybody has read and that we know has published, right? And that there are many reasons why, but in the Heidegger book, just beside the whole, deconstruction, because he uses, the phenomenological deconstruction of the original and the originary, and, and the principle of anarchy, there's a very deep and kind of like, in a way, even Nietzschean reflection, let's say the Deleuzian Nietzschean reflection on language. And also, some kind of like eschatological, if you want to say, description of a grammar that would not be structured by the prose-sen relationship, right? So the possibility for a grammar that would not be principial, that would not be a metaphysical grammar. And then, the broken hegemonies, through the 80s and what you see, in broken hegemonies along, the topology, of that you see in broken hegemonies and the analytics of the ultimates, you see a different reflection on language that, as Jan pointed out, comes out also in his response to Peg, at SPEP in 1992, and that reflection on language is a reflection that acknowledges the impossibility, right, of this kind of grammar, that a grammar that would not be subjected to, in a way, subsumption and universalization, right? So you see, so it's a different Nietzsche, right? It's a tragic kind of Nietzsche in Broken Hegemony. So they're both Nietzsche, right? Like the Heidegger book and Broken Hegemonies. But just to finish on this, Gerardo, and Gerardo and I lately, we've been Gerardo organized a beautiful seminar on Carlo Michelstädter. Was an Italian philosopher, like, who died very young, committing suicide in the early 1900s. And language, and language persuasion and rhetoric, right? They are like at the center of the koinonia kakon, right? Of the community of the wicked, of the evil ones. And I think that Schürmann really, in a way, in Origins, when he described like the appropriation of the Nazi of the German language, right? But also of this sort of struggle, agonal relationship, this conflict between language and silence, right? That comes through his, kind of like leaning towards mysticism and Zen. You see how the silence, is something that he has probably in a way looked for through images, through the image and the sensuous beauty of images. And that's certainly some kind of like, it's a reply to Eckhart's Entbildung, right? So the imagination of oneself, right? Or the imagination of, or even a sort of abandoning, releasing, or letting be of all images, right? So that's another interesting thing. But in Broken Hegemonies, and I want to close on this. Silence, is forced upon us. It's something that we are forced up. It's something that is forced upon us, but we are to speak as the tragics spoke. So in a way, it's kind of an inversion of Wittgenstein's, right? Of something that we know, that we cannot, speak, we should not speak. But for Schürmann, it's of something of what we cannot speak, and it might be like the linguistical, logical ground or foundation of the community of the wicked, right? Of what we of the tragic foundation of the community of the wicked, of something that we cannot speak about, we must speak about, right? As the tragics did. And I think we have to kind of like come into terms, like, with our what kind of oath, what kind of what kind of must, what kind of tragic command this is for us to speak, and not to fall silence, as Secundus the cynic would do, right? Secundus the silent philosopher, right? Schürmann spoke. Sorry, it was a very confused and maybe confusing intervention.
I just wanted to add that for those listening, several of the pieces in here reflect on language. In some ways, everyone is doing so obliquely, but I would highlight Vincent Blanchet's piece titled Schürmann and the Tragedy of Languages, who's really trying to think about language in broken hegemonies and trying to rethink it in some sense, and Emmeline Durand's piece on translation. And so they're both really thinking, I think, profound thoughts on language there.
Yeah, if I could add something, I think, these related concepts, or like interrelated questions of tragedy, anarchy, and releasement. I'm wondering how much of this turns on the relation between Schürmann and Hannah Arendt, because it's come up a few times, right? He, praises Arendt for her attention to those rare moments of freedom in history, yet there's a seeming inversion of the priority or primacy that Arendt grants to natality over mortality. Perhaps it's an inversion, or perhaps it's a kind of equalizing. I mean, there's the analogy of centripetal and centrifugal force, but then at the end, it does seems like mortality seems to, overcome or overtake natality. But I wonder how much of that is only due to the danger that he sees in natality, which appears to just be a pure and simple good. But then when we look throughout history, it's in fact led to violence. And then turning from question of tragedy to anarchy, and specifically political anarchy. To me, it doesn't seem to be like a logical entailment, but rather this kind of bifurcation of being itself that we may attend to. So it's that other thinking that Heidegger talks about, which itself is a form of acting, but it's that we may attend to it, not that we must. And that's evidenced by the fact that there are many people who still do not. They're still under this sway, this illusion of historical representations that have already withered away. But it's only by attending to this tragic condition that we could avoid the banality of evil. Yet I think what he's also trying to avoid is this kind of metaphysical quietism, this passive waiting for releasement, the interiority of Augustine that he critiques, and then instead it's this kind of releasement of exteriority that takes the form of political struggle. But he's also trying to avoid that from itself becoming totalizing, right? So acting and justifying whatever you do in the name of some higher cause or principle. So I think that maybe connects the three. So there's this really interesting attention to Arendt's thinking that I think could be brought out more, either by Peg or Ian or Francesco.
Yeah, David, I really appreciate that comment. And I think that relationship to Hannah Arendt, Reiner's relationship to Arendt is very fruitful. And I think it goes to something that Ian had mentioned earlier. And I think it would also point to an originality in Schürmann that we don't find in Hannah Arendt, in terms of this question of judgment, which is somewhere between thinking and acting. And I just saw that. And again, these are just sort of initial thinking thoughts, so not fleshed out in any way, but a different kind of aesthetics that might allow us to think a different relationship to language, or to think language. And I think this notion of the symbolic, and I thank you, Ian, for bringing us back to several of the essays that we weren't able to really discuss in depth here, given our time constraints. But I think they're really important for getting us started on this thinking. And again, I think because of Lafour's, and I don't think I'm going to be critical of Lafour here. I don't think that he really says much more than that modern democracy, the Declaration of Right, is a symbolic mutation of the notion of right. But I don't think he goes very far in thinking about this symbolic mutation that stages radical democracy, and in many ways might lead to its, if I may, a kind of failure, its devolution into a nationalistic democracy. Lafour certainly did not want that with his notion of an empty place of power. But I think Schürmann's work invites us to think further and differently on this symbolic mutation. I think it goes maybe to Deleuze's notion of the image of thought, that there has to be a different image of thought. I don't want to collapse Schürmann into Deleuze, but I think there's there's a conversation there that would be very fruitful. Maybe because I'm teaching with a small little group of, it's an independent study on Deleuze's logic of sense. And I keep thinking about Schürmann. He's struggling with a language that's not propositional, or within the propositional, we have this nonsense. And so all to say, I think there's a lot more to be thought about, and that Reiner offers us real ways into thinking an anarchic language, if we wanted to just say that.
Well, this has been great. We're coming to the end. I don't know if we have anyone else has any other comment or anything else to say. If not, we can just bring the session to the end here. I think it has been great. A lot of great, wonderful things have come out regarding Schürmann, and we can just encourage everyone who will be listening to this session to go to Philosophy Today website and read the many articles, because it is truly a very voluminous issue on Reiner Schürmann's thought, once again edited by Ian Moore and Francesco Guercio. And of course, I want to thank everyone for today, for the time, and for this great discussion, Peg, Ian, Francesco, and David. And for everyone who follows the series, at the end of this month, next month, we'll be back with another installment, and that will be Jasper Burns' new book, The Future of Revolution, Prospects from the Paris Commune to the George Floyd uprising. So that will be at the end of May. Once again, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you then.
Thank you, Geraldo.